We discuss the asylum and refugee system in South Africa now. We are joined by Dr. Mostoaledi. He is the Minister of Home Affairs following his meeting with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Dr. Mostoaledi, thank you very much for availing yourself again this afternoon. So the meeting, amongst other things, discussed the strengthening of asylum and refugee system in South Africa. You took a look at legislative reform. What do we need to know where that is concerned in terms of strengths and weaknesses?
Thank you very much. Let me also greet the viewers and listeners out there. Thank you for having me. Well, all in all, the meeting we had with United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, the Assistant Commissioner for Protection, came with 7 outcomes, but I think 4 of them are, to me, extremely important. Without saying the others are not, but the 4 to me are at the core. The first outcome we had was the debate, the issue, the clarity rather, about statelessness and the issue of legislative reform, as we have mentioned, and the issue of durable solution in terms of voluntary repatriation of people back to the countries where they came from, and the issue of dealing with the backlog of asylum seekers in South Africa, which developed especially in 2008, from 2008, when the situation in Zimbabwe became worse. Those are the 4 most important outcomes, but the 3 others are also part of that.
And legislative reform, what do we need to know, strengths and weaknesses of our legislation when it comes to refugees and the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa?
There are two things rather, not 3, 2 things under legislative reform. And this we brought to the United Nations just for their support, because it's already a decision we've made on our own. That number 1, we need to review the Citizenship Act of 1995, the Refugee Act of 1998, and the Immigration Act of 2002. We need to review them and to bring them in line with our present realities, because as you hear here, from 1995, those acts were passed in a different era and the circumstances were different. So we need to bring them in line with the present era, of course, also in terms of what is practiced internationally. The second thing in that regard is that we realize that in terms of international trends, generally a Citizenship Act, a Refugee Act, and Immigration Act are put as one act, maybe with different chapters, rather than put separately. Because when you put them separately, they are also implemented differently by different branches who may not be talking to each other, and sometimes they contradict each other. So that's why we are reviewing them. And I must state that we are already far advanced in this review. It's possible that in the next quarter, we'll be taking this to Parliament. That means the policy about citizenship, immigration and refugee.
Help us understand, Minister, this concept of statelessness. Who would be stateless, under what circumstances, and how does South Africa treat stateless people?
I want to give you a background with why we actually took this issue to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, why we put it on the agenda. You may remember that a few weeks back, I think it was in December, if not November, but December, there were a group of NGOs together with some human rights organizations who together marched to the Department of Home Affairs and tried to bulldoze the Department of Home Affairs into issuing birth certificates of children born of non-South African parents, but children who were born in the territory of South Africa. And they were claiming that if we don't give them birth certificates and subsequently IDs, we are rendering them stateless. That was the argument. And if you remember, we went out to refute that argument. And we just wanted to check with United Nations. And I'm happy that the United Nations agreed. And let me read you what the outcome was on statelessness. It said the outcome is that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees agrees that South Africa is not obliged to grant citizenship to every child born in South African territory to non-South African parents unless there's an indication that it will lead to statelessness in line with the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. And then it further goes on to say that all that is required is that the Republic of South Africa must issue a birth record to be presented to the country where they are deserving of citizenship, which is what we have been doing all the time. Every time a child is born of non-South African parents, but born on our territory, we used to give them a birth record, which they must take to their embassy and say, please give me relevant documents relevant to my country, because this child was born here in the Republic of South Africa, but I belong to such and such a country. People have been rejecting those, saying it's discrimination if we don't give them birth certificate. And we've been explaining that we can't do that. The United Nations agreed with us, especially when we explained to them the number of children from neighboring countries who come to South Africa, where pregnant women just come to South Africa to give birth because they are looking for health services. They are not looking for citizenship or statehood because they do have their own countries. Now we're happy that United Nations have clarified this matter, but we went on to say United Nations must finalize and give us all a definition of exactly what statelessness is, because we think some people want to distort its meaning just in order to abuse it.
Mr. Mostoaledi, in understanding statelessness, perhaps maybe let me go back and ask you, who is a refugee?
A refugee is a person who came to your country and announced themselves as an asylum seeker, and in the case of South Africa, reported themselves at the Refugee Reception Center, and we've got 5 of them. And once you report yourself as a Refugee Reception Center that you are an asylum seeker, you are issued with a Section 22 permit, Section 20 a permit under Section 22 of the Refugee Act. Then you start applying. Now, when you apply, what is checked? You are going to be admitted in terms of the United Nations Convention of 1951 and the South African Refugee Act of 1998. What is it? What is looked at? In other words, how do you qualify? And I think that's your question. You qualify if, number one, your country has got a natural disaster like floods, earthquake, volcanoes, fires, where you have to run and you stood no chance of surviving if you didn't run to the next country without any documents. Secondly, if there is war in your country, and I don't have to define what happens during war, you are actually allowed to run to the next country and ask for asylum. And thirdly, if you are being persecuted, and you may be persecuted for 4 things. Number one, for your political activities in that particular country, which might not be in line with the rulers of that country. Number 2, if you are persecuted for your traditional beliefs and practices. Number 3, for your religious teachings or practices or preaching in that country. And lastly, for your sexual orientation. Those are the grounds on which you become a refugee in the next country. And people confuse it because sometimes they come here as economic migrants and claim refugee status, when the United Nations Convention and the Refugee Act do say nothing at all about economic migration.
Mr. Mostoaledi, thank you very much for that, because with then understanding who a refugee is and then understanding statelessness, what I deduce from this conversation is that the person that would be running away for political persecution, for instance, from a country and coming to South Africa, they are stateless here, they are stateless in their own country, they have nowhere to go. Well, I do understand that South Africa is under no obligation to give anybody any documents, and you have the right to look after the interests of South Africans. Do we not need to then reimagine how we engage on this issue? While I also appreciate that we have to follow international conventions and engage with international bodies, there's a lot of accusations being put at the Department of Home Affairs for creating a system where people are not able to get documentation legally. You speak of refugee reception centers. Some have been closed since 2020.
Let me correct one thing. when you run to a country as a refugee or an asylum seeker, you are not stateless. Let's clarify that. You are not stateless. You are just being persecuted. You are running to another country to get international protection. When you are given refugee status in that country, you are under international protection. But you are not stateless. You still have a country. It's only that things in our country are not good for you at that particular moment in time. Things might actually change, as it has done, for instance, in Angola, meaning refugee is not a permanent status. It's just a temporary status because of what's happening in your country. And the example I'm giving, Angola, is a good one. When there was war in Angola, a war staged by the Jonas Savimbi regime against the MPL government, when that war was over, United Nations reported publicly that anybody who ran off Angola because of that conflict and became a refugee, that problem is over, you can go back home. So you can't go back home if you're stateless. A stateless person is the one who has got nowhere to go because there's no country in the world they are attached to. Nobody knows which country they are attached to at all, and that's exactly why they are stateless and not refugees. I just wanted to clarify that. Now, on the issue of not allowing people to get documentation, I want to explain it very clearly. In terms of the United Nations Convention of 1951, when you appear at somebody's border without documents and say you are an asylum seeker, let me choose an example of South Africa because I understand the rules there very well. You are now supposed to be allowed to come in, and they must give you immediately a document which is called a Section 23 permit. It's a permit under the immigration law, not the Refugee Act, but the Immigration Act. That document gives you permission to be in the country for 5 days. And it's documentation, it's official documentation. No law enforcement officer will touch you with that. The 5 days is to give you a chance to arrive at the Refugee Reception Center. And I told you there are 5 such centers in South Africa. One in Musina, one here in Pretoria, the Refugee Reception Center, one in Cape Town, the other in Kabeja, and the last one in Tequini. Once you arrive there, you announce yourself as an asylum seeker. You are immediately issued a Section 22 permit. That is Section 22 of the Refugee Act. That permit says you have got the right to stay here in South Africa for 3 to 6 months while you are applying. That is also official documentation. No law enforcement agency needs to trouble you when you have got that document. Then you start the application process. If you become successful, then you are awarded a Section 24 permit. That is Section 24 of the Refugee Act. You are a fully fledged refugee. You are under international protection. If you are rejected, you would now have a right to apply to the Refugee Appeals Authority of South Africa. Now, people who are not documented are the people who never showed themselves anywhere, who just came in and went into hiding, and Home Affairs is blamed for not documenting them. Those documents I've given you are documentation. When then a child is born of non-South African parents, that child is immediately given a record of birth. That is also official documentation. So I think we need to clarify the story of who is undocumented and what are the reasons for non-documentation, because Home Affairs seems to be blamed even for activities or attitudes of other people.
That was the Home Affairs Minister, Dr. Mostoaledi. That's all the time we can afford this afternoon. Thank you very much for availing yourself, Minister.